When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Whom do people say the Son of Man is?"
If I were a secular historian and looking at what Jesus is saying, I'd say this guy clearly thinks that he's some kind of emissary from heaven.
They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets."
There are also many implicit indications that Jesus was more than an ordinary human being.
"What about you?" he asks. "Whom do you say that I am?"
I think that the voice addressed Jesus. "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased."
Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, and the Son of the living God." Today, Jesus' question continues to challenge historians and theologians, believers and unbelievers alike. Some still acclaim him as the Messiah, the Son of God, as did his followers in the first century. Others declare that Jesus never said or did most of what is recorded about him in the Gospels. Still, the search for Jesus continues.
Welcome. I'm John Ankerberg, and we've traveled to 3 continents to ask historians and archaeologists, is the Jesus of history the same as the Jesus of the Christian faith? What can we really know about him? Recently, these questions captured the attention of ABC, resulting in a 2-hour program entitled The Search for Jesus, and it was hosted by Peter Jennings. After it aired, we became aware that many scholars wanted to give a second opinion about what was said. You know about second opinions. If your doctor diagnoses you with a serious illness and you question his diagnosis, you would not hesitate to ask for a second opinion. And many of the conclusions given about Jesus in the ABC special, they didn't seem to ring true. So we decided to check with 13 other doctors and ask them for a second opinion. We even talked to a few of the same scholars ABC did, just to make sure we were hearing them correctly. One such scholar was Dr. N.T. Wright, who taught at Oxford University in England for 22 years. He is presently canon theologian of Westminster Abbey and is respected as one of the foremost historical Jesus scholars in the world today. I asked him who he thought Jesus really was.
So who was Jesus? Jesus was a prophet announcing the kingdom of God, a first-century Jewish Palestinian announcing that God was now becoming king. Jesus believed that he was the one who was bringing that kingdom in himself, that he was Israel's Messiah. He believed that he had to do this through his own suffering and death in obedience to a vocation shaped by Israel's scriptures. And he believed that in being and doing all of this, he was the very embodiment of Israel's God come to redeem his people.
Now, Dr. Wright's conclusions were not what most people came away with after watching the ABC special about Jesus. Why? You know, you may have picked up a newspaper and read the opinions of a group of scholars referred to as the Jesus Seminar. Well, many people assume that the opinions of this group represent what most scholars think about Jesus. We decided to ask scholars in Canada, America, Europe, and here in Israel how they evaluated the conclusions of the Jesus Seminar. And what they said might surprise you.
The opinion is not very good, to put it mildly. A continental scholarship, they either haven't heard of the Jesus Seminar, or if they have, they dismiss it derisively. British scholarship is just the same way. The Jesus Seminar, oh, you must be kidding. Does anybody take them seriously? That's the European response. I've seen that firsthand.
Peter Jennings and others who investigate these matters should be aware that there's a wide spectrum of scholarly opinions, and the Jesus Seminar represents a rather radical approach to the Gospels.
My guess is that most British, French, Belgian, German scholars today, if they have heard of the Jesus Seminar, would simply say, well, I'm afraid that's some funny people in America, and we're carrying on with our scholarship, and we're not going to bother about that.
What about in scholarly circles in our own country? Do they lead the way?
No, they do not. They try to be influential, and they've had positions of leadership at the Society of Biblical Literature. I'm an active member of the Historical Jesus section of the Society of Biblical Literature. 300-400 show up typically at their meetings. That's about 10 times what typically show up at a Jesus Seminar meeting. And the Jesus Seminar guys, when they present their distinctive views, like a non-eschatological Jesus or the Gospel of Peter as a primary source for the other Gospels, those views are simply, to put it with slang, blown out of the water.
Now, besides featuring the unsupported ideas of the Jesus Seminar, ABC also went to people on the streets in Bethlehem and Nazareth and asked them what they thought about Jesus. We discovered scholars weren't impressed with this approach either.
I would say that the ABC special chose to begin from a skeptical view and chose to actually start with man-in-the-street interviews, which any credible scholar would have to laugh at. Why would we expect, for example, someone walking the streets of San Francisco today to be able to talk with any kind of knowledge about the gold rush in California in 1848? Or someone walking the streets of Ireland to be able to talk with any type of credibility about the Great Potato Famine? These people are not the people who have spent their lives researching and exploring the issues.
Now, if someone wants to discover what Jesus really said and did here in the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, what historical evidence can they turn to? Well, as Peter Jennings pointed out, all scholars turn to the earliest books written about Jesus, and that's the four Gospels. And right here, the debate about Jesus begins. What kind of books are the Gospels? Can we trust them?
Well, where you begin with your oldest sources, your oldest and most reliable sources. And we've got them. We have four Gospels in the New Testament.
And if we want to deal with the historicity of Jesus, then we have to immerse ourselves into the tools that are there for examining that. That includes the Gospels, the literary texts. It includes extra-biblical material as well, writings of other Jewish authors like Josephus. It includes archaeology and a study of biblical languages like Hebrew and Greek.
Now, some scholars claim that the writers of the four Gospels were passionately biased followers of Jesus. Therefore, it is doubtful that they accurately reported what happened.
In the ancient world, nobody had yet invented the notion of objective, dispassionate chronicling of history simply for history's sake. They wouldn't bother to retell the story of somebody if they didn't feel there was something that could be learned from it.
You can have history and theology together. Just think of the word perspective instead of theology. What the Gospels give us is the perspective of disciples and those who believe Jesus in terms of what he did and said. And granted, they have a bias, if you want to use that word. They have a prejudice. They are believers. There's no doubt about it. But they are trying to convince the reader this is who Jesus was, this is what he did, and in fact, this is who he is as well in the process.
Simply because somebody believes passionately in a subject that they tell about doesn't by any means necessarily mean that they'll distort the facts. Sometimes the reverse is the case. A great modern-day example are many Jewish historians of the Nazi Holocaust who've been passionately committed to never seeing such an atrocity reduplicated, and for that very reason they have very carefully and accurately chronicled the horrors in a way that the so-called revisionist historians, mostly Gentile, trying to downplay the atrocities, have not done so.
And so just because the New Testament gospel writers have a theological interest, and that's what drives them to tell the story of Jesus in the first place, that doesn't disqualify their writing. It doesn't make it suddenly unhistorical or of no value.
What would you say to a person who's really skeptical and says that Matthew didn't write Matthew, Mark didn't write Mark, Luke didn't write Luke, and John didn't write John?
Sum total of the evidence that we have from the early church fathers is that the four men, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that the New Testament is typically ascribed to, two of them apostles, Matthew and John, two of them companions of apostles, Mark and Luke, are in fact the people who wrote the stories about Jesus.
Peter Jennings said in the special, it is pretty much agreed among scholars that the gospel writers were not eyewitnesses. What would you say to that?
Well, two of the gospel writers were not